death. Another liars are subjects today. Well, fictional character death anyway. It happens in all kinds of genres and in every type of story. Death is a fundamental part of storytelling and has been for hundreds and hundreds of years. The main difference between real-life death and fictional death being, of course, is that a certain someone has full control over fictional universes. A writer can be pulling the strings, orchestrating deaths and sacrifices to impact their story. There are many reasons writers decide to kill off their protagonists. Sometimes it can be played as a shock moment, heroic sacrifice, or just a totally unavoidable event depending on the context. The trick is to do it for the right reasons, and in a way that will satisfy the reader. In 1893, thousands of English readers cancelled their subscription to The Strand when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle killed off Sherlock Holmes. Conan Doyle was simply tired of the series and the character and wanted to move on to the other things. He was a little surprised by the reader's controversial outrage, and eventually he succumbed to public pressure and resurrected the beloved detective in The Hound of the Baskervilles. Various authors use the impact of death in many different ways, and we'll explore some of them today, focusing specifically on manga and animation. A medium where death can be common, and there are series where the entire presence of death is heavily implicated. Namely, we'll be exploring Naruto, Attack on Titan, Battle Royale, Marvel and DC, and Gurren Lagann. Fans seem to have mixed reactions about the utilization of character deaths in these various series. Criticism has been levelled at creators that they're both too free with the axe, or ironically, not bloodthirsty enough. Criticism has been placed on both, with some authors playing it too safe, whilst others end up killing characters just for the sake of it without much consideration.
They're all dead, you know.
There should have been another way.
But consideration for what? We're okay with violence in our storytelling, with battle and war in our fiction. In fact, it's commonplace. Every other day in shonen, at least, the world is ending. We watch movies where whole cities full of nameless, faceless people get flattened, or baked, or blown up without batting an eyelash or shedding a tear. But hey, introduce a little sudden death of main character syndrome and fans can suddenly go emotional, and even angry at a writer. One take on the use of death is the absolute route. And if there's anything that does that, was Battle Royale. Battle Royale is the bloodthirsty and tragic game of a class of schoolchildren forced to fight to the death on an island until one victor remains. Think Hunger Games, but good. In a story with such setup as that, you have to be very mature and consistent in how you're going to handle the theme of death. People go into this story like this expecting bloodshed, with the same mentality as one would a Roman Colosseum or a Shakespeare play. And sure enough, they get what they wanted. Almost every chapter, actually. The tone of the topic is handled very seriously, showing that death is the very end and is always on the table. Deaths are vicious, but not played in a fun or comic way like Gurren Lagann or a Tarantino flick would. No, Battle Royale wants to show you the true implications and sheer brutality of death, by making you watch innocent and not so innocent people come to terms with the action of murder. They have to deal with their conscience and the absolute nature of the act as the de-establishment of their moral system crumbles. But most importantly, it's also the focus. Death isn't a byproduct of the narrative, it is what the narrative revolves around. An added aspect that sets it apart from the other criteria on this list is that for the most part of the series, it's somewhat ambiguous as to who the main characters even will be. Who will and won't make it into the finale, and for this reason, with so many ongoing subplots, you can make favourites and have them killed in the next chapter. This means that the main characters can't technically be killed off because there aren't any until the end, where it's just down to the final few. Not to name and shame again, but this is where Hunger Games fails to strike in the concept of death. Whilst in the games, your clear protagonist is Katniss. You follow her all the time, and so the audience wants her to win. There's a very laid out map of who are the bad guys, the allies, and the fodder, and you know who exactly will kick it and who will win, and that's why you'll never really fear for Katniss or her friends. You know the person you're following will win because, hey, nobody else has, been shown, so, one of them winning would be entirely unsatisfying. Battle Royale keeps a certain kind of ambiguity and doesn't go for favoritism, meaning that the surprise and consequence of death lands that much harder. Naruto Shippuden is a story not unfamiliar with the concept of death, but at the same time, the idea seems quite alien to the series. Much like the archetypal shonen, Naruto for a while follows the storyline where death is present, but largely for the antagonists. Usually when they've been defeated or do something stupid resulting in their own death, you know, the usual. Admittedly, there are a lot of deaths in the Naruto world, even as early on as the first arc, but it still oddly feels like there should be more. Naruto is not an extreme manga, the demographic is like 15 to 25 year old guys, and as conventions go, it follows a lot of the usual manga code, but something still feels off. The consistent yet not indulgent deaths of the first part of the series set a boundary. It's established that they live in a world where war is constant and death just happens. You know, it's a fighting show, so there are costs when things get serious. And yet, Naruto in fact does not remain consistent. The current arc we've been in for the last few years is the Shinobi World War, which is thought to be the finale of the series' long 10-year run. There is one huge final battlefield with the entire assembled cast and an army of millions gathered against one major threat. Fans are ecstatic to see action, character development, some big important deaths, but most importantly, closure. A huge criticism of Kishimoto's final arc is that there is a poignant lack of deaths, and admittedly, it is very noticeable. Many feel that to emulate a real war, Kishimoto should take off the kitty gloves and deliver a violent and unforgiving battlefield, but yet so few characters in the war actually end up dying. Many nameless characters kick the dust on and off screen, but this is not impactful in the slightest. We don't know these nameless people, and with a cast as big as Naruto's, you'd think they could spare one or two named characters. And trust me, they can. Having every main and side character joined on the final field is not only tiring, but also crowded. The appeal slowly wears off, even after more characters join the fray, and it soon becomes clear Kishimoto was struggling and failing to distribute fair panel time to everyone. The entire war cannot be captured anymore because of the huge character roster, and so fan favourite main characters may not randomly be seen for weeks or even months at a time. People simply do not care about the deaths of no-names, at least not in Naruto anyway. See, this story has conditioned its audience into somewhat expecting main and side character deaths. There haven't been many nameless ninja in the series before this war, so as a result, a series like Naruto will never shock or involve the audience with a character they don't know. Other shows may be able to provoke this response, but Naruto is not one of them. It is the archetype of a character we as readers make a bond with. When the bond is broken, there is change, and the future will not be the same without that character. Our comfort zone has been invaded by a change we were not expecting. But it's also important to remember that all characters are ultimately fictional literary tools, and if they don't have anything more to contribute to the main direction of the story, which many do not, they are disposable. From experience anyway, we've realised that killing characters makes them more fondly remembered, and usually makes for some very memorable, sad and awesome moments. Battle Royale understands this, but by the end, the readers become hugely desensitized to violence, having it be a common event in the narrative. If anything, Naruto Shippuden has the opposite problem to Battle Royale. In Naruto's case, there are actually a few characters who actively annoy me just by being alive at this point. Characters like Kakashi, Might Guy or Obito have become perfect potential for sacrifice. Imagine if Kakashi died during their fights and Obito came out of a dimension holding his corpse to taunt Naruto. That would seriously raise the tension in a second. But no, he somehow wins and awkwardly hangs about on the battlefield watching for the next year. Fine, it's not manga ruining, but it's unsatisfying. Now, Neji's death last year almost did this, but it was too insignificant and random to leave a lasting impression. Death should have been on the table in every chapter in the finale. I mean, think about it like this. Weaker characters that we know and love have been on the same arena as Obito, the God Tree, and Madara Uchiha. Having them all be A-OK is disappointing and unrealistic. I assure you, we'd all be much more pumped for every chapter if we were all fearing on who might or might not be taken out next. Instead, we have a whole catalogue of characters hanging around doing nothing. And that's what anime like Attack on Titan and Full Metal Alchemist and Death Note understand. Death is used as a literary tool, and when it happens, it has a huge impact on the audience. It's the ultimate character arc ender, and it's just satisfying. The concept of war always breeds death, but this war hasn't had the danger factor that a war should have. Especially when you have characters just straight up denying death, or people from the past zombified and coming back. You're just adding to the problem. But enough about Naruto. Another series that loves its shock deaths would be my personal favourite, Gurren Lagann. This show provides you with a fun and playful tone with ultimately two main characters, the cowardly Simone and the hothead older brother figure Kamina. The early episodes of this series really focus on setting up the brotherly bond these two share, as lighthearted and silly as it is. I mean, one episode is a filler of them having a comedy fan service episode in a hot spring mecca. Yeah, and the next one? Kamina is brutally killed, in a really surprising and violent manner. The total juxtaposition of silly to serious hits the audience on a whole new level like a wall, and the show changes its dynamic instantly. One of the main characters is suddenly taken away from us, leaving everyone else in the series to mature as characters. This death, as such, creates the future of the show, as it's what inspires pretty much everything else. Death is less seen as a morbid absolute part of life in this show, and more of a manly stereotypical means of sacrifice. Not many characters die in this show, but when it is, it's always a sign of heroism, and never is such a sacrifice regretted. They go out in style like badasses, always being fondly remembered rather than grieved over.
So this is the power of the spiral. Not bad at all.
Honestly, it's a silly, yet really surprisingly mature treatment. They remember their dead fondly. Once they are dead, the dead remain dead. No second chances. The difference with Attack on Titan and the comic book genre in general is that death doesn't really remain permanent. This can either be by resurrection or by retcon, a revision which changes earlier continuity, basically meaning they didn't die in the first place. This phenomenon is known as the comic book death. Killing off a main character such as Superman, Spider-Man or Captain America can often lead to an uptick in publicity for a comic book. And it does, because it's happened several times, as well as high sales for the return story where they're inevitably brought back due to popular demand. It doesn't surprise me that people would have such emotional reactions to a fictional character's death. People come to fiction to be taken away from the concerns of their everyday life, as a form of escapism. But when confronted with the sudden death of a beloved character, viewers and readers are jarred into dealing with the uncertainty of life in their fiction, and that can be unnerving. Look at reactions to the first murder in Psycho, literally any episode of Game of Thrones, or the death of Cedric Diggory in Harry Potter as examples of manipulated deaths outside of animation. There's plenty, as death isn't a writing device that's just limited to this genre. Many authors use the tactic to drive the emotional point home or make a statement. Since the earliest stories, the death of a character, a father, a lover, a king, has created the setup for many famous tales in folklore and the stories we read today. It's a blunt yet efficient technique to provoke response and start a story. Some genres just exhibit death more than others. It comes down to the base fear of death and uncertainty that people face every day. Death is a subject that makes people uncomfortable because it's a real-life element introduced into their fictional, magical world. While some people can split real death from fictional death, it doesn't change the fact that it's the one ultimate thing that binds our world with these fictional universes. That despite all these god powers and superpowers, they're just as mortal as us. And that's important.